I haven't thought about him for over 10 years. You know that feeling when you're really young and the night seems to crawl with strange sounds and shifting shadows? As though every time the lights go off, something just creeps out from the darkness just out of sight. You grow up and eventually forget those things. Your mind matures and you realize they're just primal fears taking the shape of whatever hides under the bed, inside the closet, behind the door. I had those fears. And then I grew up. My friends grew up. They forgot their nighttime terrors. But my fears stayed. They followed me. There was one in particular. I call him Mr. Scissors. I would always feel him before I saw him. In fact, it took me years to actually see him, but I'd known he was there long before. I still remember the first time vividly. It was sometime late into the night. Everyone was fast asleep and the house was silent. I must have been 6 or 7. I woke up and in my sleepy state felt creeped out by the darkness, not daring to take my head out from under the covers. I lay stock still, breathing quietly and shallow. Several minutes must have passed, and I was just slipping back into sleep when a terrible shiver coursed its way through my body. A terror so inexplicable pinned me to my bed. I don't know what it was. I didn't hear anything, see anything, nothing. But I somehow knew that something was going wrong, that I was no longer alone in the room. I felt watched. I felt like the slightest movement would give me away, that whatever was here would hurt me if I peeked out of the covers. In my state of fright, I began to hear things, the very faintest trace of a creaking floorboard, the sound of my bedroom door scraping against the warped floor, and the sound of scissors opening and closing. One could easily pass that off as a particularly acute night terror and nothing more, but that night has stayed engraved in my mind ever since, because I knew it was the first time he'd found me. The terrors continued for months. It was as though every night I would be torn from my sleep to be faced by that same freezing fear, and I never got used to it. Like waking up into a nightmare, but I knew that I was awake. That this was real. The first evidence that it was real came about 5 months later. Spring had arrived and my parents were giving the house a good clean, and amongst the plans were the idea to rearrange my room. I sat on my bed as my parents discussed what would be moved to where, while I would excitedly chip in my own suggestions. Then I watched gleefully as they took some heavy trinkets off my bookcase, ready to shift to a different position. My heart sank as I saw the wallpaper behind it. Torn, ripped, slashed. It was as though someone had taken a sharp knife and repeatedly ran it through the wallpaper, leaving it in thin, angry shreds. My parents paused in utter shock, then turned around to look at me with disgrace. Without another word, my dad crossly heaved my wardrobe out of the way. More slashes. The wallpaper fell off in strips. For a full half hour, they yelled at me. But I could hardly hear them. All I could think about was Mr. Scissors. I knew exactly who had done it. And he now had a name. My parents took my scissors away from my room. That night, I didn't even fall asleep. I knew he would come. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. I was just about to check my alarm clock again when the fear arrived. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand. My breathing tightened. Snip, snip. The sound was no longer faint. It was loud, tangible, real, as though it were slicing into my mind. Snip, snip. I heard a light footstep, pages turning. Snip, snip. I took a sharp breath of fear. Suddenly, the sound stopped, followed by a harrowing silence. I could feel him looking at me, Mr. Scissors. My beating heart halted violently as a grinding sound vibrated through my bed, like a knife on wood. Silence. Snip, snip, right above my head. I could feel paper shreds falling onto my sheets. All I could do was cower in fear for the rest of the night as the silent sound of snipping shredded the silence into fragments of horror. Every time I thought he'd gone, I'd hear a single snip, and then more silence. Only when sunlight shone through my bedsheets did I dare get out of bed. I immediately noticed that there were no shreds of paper on the floor. No sign of cutting stuff up. I began to doubt myself until I saw the end of my bed. On the 4 wooden bedposts were arrows engraved, all pointing to where I had been lying. I ran my finger along one, feeling the crude splinters. On the floor in the corner was a book. I don't remember what it was called, but it was one of my favorites growing up, about a boy who didn't want a bath, so he would run away from his parents across the countryside until they caught him. All the corners of the pages had been cut off. Sort of like a dog ear. Over the years, more and more of my books would get cut up in various ways. Once, I found all the people in a book had had their faces removed. Another time, random letters had been carved into the pages, but I couldn't discern a pattern or meaning behind them. And then he disappeared. It must have been around the time when I was 13. And I hadn't heard of him for nearly 6 months. At first, it went unnoticed. I would sleep through the night without waking up in a terror, but I soon realized that the pattern had changed. I experienced a mix of relief and puzzlement. So, I let my guard down. Big mistake. A year had passed, and Mr. Scissors was seemingly a thing of the past. I no longer thought of him before falling asleep. But one night, I woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards out in the hallway. I lay there half asleep, wondering who was up at this time of night. I didn't feel the usual stab of fear, just drowsiness. It was that lack of fear that lulled me into a false sense of security. I sat up, my eyes still half shut, and called out, "Mom?" in a slurred tone. Nothing. I opened my eyes. Barely visible in the doorway was the dark silhouette of a person staring directly at me. I remember 2 things vividly. A shady hat casting Mr. Scissors' face in the shadows, and the unmistakable glint of scissor blades catching the faint moon rays. The last thing I saw before I buried myself under the covers was that slow movement of the blades closing on each other. Snip. The next few minutes were filled with the screech of what sounded like claws on a chalkboard, mixed with violent thumps as the figure strode across my room with heavy, uncoordinated footsteps. It only stopped when my parents burst into my room, flicked the light switch on, only to gasp as they saw words scribbled into the floorboards and on the walls. Without warning, my father heaved me out of the bed and pulled me out of the room. The rest of the night is somewhat fuzzy. I only remember seeing the concerned horror on my mother's face and the words, "sever you," on the wall. There were more words, but I didn't have the time to read them. I told my parents about Mr. Scissors that night, although I doubt they believed me, and after that I never saw or heard him again. So they eventually thought I'd had a mental breakdown in the night or something and slowly forgot about it. Although they have never been comfortable around me while I'm holding scissors or a knife, even today. I forgot about him too. Until today. I am moving out of my house, and today I transferred the furniture to a van. While I was busy in the living room packing boxes, my friend called up from my bedroom in a strange tone. Told me to come quick. I stood frozen at the doorway as I saw the entirety of the wall behind my wardrobe had been reduced to shreds. Snip, snip.